The chandeliers of the Pembroke Ballroom cast a golden glow over the sea of silk gowns and formal attire below, illuminating the cream of London society as they swirled and gossiped beneath the gilded ceiling. Lady Eleanor Blackwood stood at the periphery, her 26 years weighing upon her shoulders as she observed the whirling couples with a mixture of resignation and carefully concealed longing. Her lavender gown, modest and at least one season out of fashion, had seemed perfectly adequate when she had left home, but now beneath the critical eyes of the ton, she felt every inadequacy of the garment and, by extension, herself. Eleanor possessed the kind of beauty that required a second glance to appreciate, intelligence shining in her deep brown eyes, her chestnut hair arranged simply compared to the elaborate style surrounding her. She had just summoned the courage to approach a circle of acquaintances when Lady Victoria Winfield, the acknowledged beauty of 3 seasons, turned with a predatory smile that immediately caused Eleanor to falter mid-step. Some ladies would be better served remaining with their books rather than attempting to join society, Lady Victoria said, her voice perfectly calibrated to carry to nearby guests without appearing to be a direct attack. The group tittered obligingly, several glancing at Eleanor with expressions ranging from embarrassment to poorly disguised amusement. Eleanor felt the blood rush to her cheeks as the barb found its target with precise accuracy. Her reputation for preferring libraries to ballrooms was well known, as was Lady Victoria's resentment of Eleanor's connections to several influential literary circles that had rejected Victoria's more superficial attempts at intellectual engagement. The worst part was not the mockery itself, but the grain of truth it contained. Eleanor did feel more at home among books than people, having discovered early that volumes bound in leather judged less harshly than those bound in corsets and cravats. She stood frozen for a moment, mortification washing through her veins like ice water, yet years of her mother's careful training in proper behavior allowed her to maintain an outward composure that belied her inner turmoil. With a slight nod that acknowledged the hit without conceding defeat, Eleanor turned away, her back straight, her steps measured. She could feel the weight of stares following her retreat, hear the whispers already beginning to circulate. Despite her respectable family name and comfortable, if not vast, fortune, Eleanor had never quite mastered the delicate art of belonging in these gilded rooms where lineage and beauty counted for more than the contents of one's mind or character. As she navigated between groups of laughing guests, careful to keep her expression neutral despite the burning behind her eyes, Eleanor realized that this incident was merely the culmination of a lifetime spent on the periphery, forever looking in at a society that valued precisely the qualities she lacked and dismissed those she possessed in abundance. What she needed now was escape, temporary though it might be, to a place where she could catch her breath and rebuild her armor before facing the glittering battlefield once more, or, perhaps more honestly, somewhere to hide until she could slip away, without drawing further attention to her humiliation. Eleanor slipped from the ballroom with practiced discretion, navigating the less traveled corridors of Pembroke House until she found herself before the heavy oak doors that promised sanctuary. With trembling fingers she turned the brass handle and stepped inside the vast library, the sounds of the ball immediately muffled as the door swung shut behind her. The room welcomed her with familiar comfort, dim and peaceful, illuminated only by a few oil lamps that cast soft halos of amber light across sections of the space, leaving corners and alcoves in soothing shadow. The scent enveloped her instantly, that distinctive fragrance of leather bindings, aging paper, and furniture polish that had always signaled safety to her since childhood. Towering shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with countless volumes arranged in meticulous order, their spines creating a tapestry of burgundy, forest green, and rich navy blue. Eleanor moved deeper into the room, exhaling fully for what felt like the first time all evening, her fingers instinctively reaching out to trail along the book spines as she passed. The cool leather beneath her fingertips grounded her, reminding her of who she truly was, beyond the inadequate social creature that Lady Victoria had so effortlessly exposed. Better to be judged for absence than presence, she thought, a rueful smile touching her lips as she allowed herself the honesty of this admission. Here, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom and imagination of countless minds across centuries. The petty cruelties of a ballroom seemed almost laughably insignificant. Eleanor wandered toward a secluded window seat partially hidden behind a tall shelf of historical texts, a spot that would remain invisible from the doorway should anyone else seek temporary escape from the festivities. As she settled onto the cushioned bench, the distant strains of the orchestra barely audible through thick walls and heavy draperies, the tears she had so valiantly contained finally spilled over. They fell silently, without the indignity of sobs, merely the release of accumulated tension as her shoulders gradually relaxed from their defensive posture. In this moment of privacy, Eleanor acknowledged the truth that she had spent years attempting to conform to a society that fundamentally misunderstood and devalued her essential nature. Books had never found her wanting, had never cruelly dismissed her contributions or mocked her preferences. They offered their wisdom freely without judgment, revealing their secrets to anyone patient enough to seek them, regardless of beauty or social standing. She drew a handkerchief from her sleeve and dabbed at her eyes, breathing deeply as she composed herself. The library stood as a perfect counterpoint to the ballroom she had fled, calm where that space was frenetic, substantive where it was superficial, welcoming where it was exclusionary. Eleanor knew she would eventually need to return, to maintain appearances if nothing else. But for now she allowed herself this moment of restoration among silent companions that had sustained her through countless disappointments. She rose and moved toward one particularly inviting section of shelves, determined to spend at least a quarter hour in worthwhile company before facing the remainder of the evening. The moon had emerged from behind clouds, sending silver light streaming through tall windows to illuminate the titles before her, and Eleanor felt her spirit lift as she contemplated which volume might best fortify her for the return to social warfare. The amber glow of a lamp suddenly illuminated the dark corner, where Eleanor had sought refuge, causing her to start violently, the book she had been examining tumbling from her hands to the thick carpet below. Escaping the tedium as well, Lady Eleanor inquired a deep voice from the shadows, its rich timbre filling the space between them with unexpected intimacy. Eleanor instinctively pressed herself back against the bookcase, her heart hammering wildly as a tall figure emerged from the darkness beyond the lamplight. She recognized him instantly, though they had never been formally introduced, the notorious Duke of Thornfield, Sebastian Blackthorne. His reputation preceded him like a storm front, whispered about in drawing rooms across London with a mixture of fear and fascination. At 35, he commanded attention not through conventional handsomeness but through sheer force of presence, his broad shoulders and considerable height making the spacious library corner suddenly feel confining. But it was his eyes that truly arrested her, a penetrating grey that seemed to cut through pretense and artifice with surgical precision. Eleanor felt those eyes now taking in her tear-stained cheeks and defensive posture, assessing and cataloguing with unsettling thoroughness. More disturbing still was his use of her name, confirming he knew precisely who she was despite their paths never having officially crossed. "I apologize for disturbing your solitude, Your Grace," Eleanor managed, hastily wiping away the evidence of her distress with trembling fingers. "I did not realize the library was occupied." The embarrassment of being discovered in such a vulnerable state nearly eclipsed her earlier humiliation in the ballroom. The Duke bent to retrieve the fallen book, examining its cover with unexpected interest before extending it toward her. "Herodotus," he observed, an unusual choice for ballroom escapees. Most ladies retreat to novels of a more romantic nature. The statement held no mockery, merely observation, yet Eleanor felt herself bristle slightly at the implied generalization. "I find historical accounts more grounding than fiction when one's spirits require settling," she responded before she could consider the wisdom of engaging with a man whose business dealings had reportedly ruined multiple families and whose cutting remarks in society had reduced more than one proud matron to tears. The Duke regarded her with renewed interest, his intimidating countenance shifting subtly. "Most people seek comfort in fantasy rather than reality when distressed," he noted, moving to place the lamp on a nearby table rather than departing as she had expected. The movement brought him further into the light, revealing the impeccable tailoring of his black evening attire and the subtle weariness etched around his eyes. suggesting a man who found social obligations as taxing as she did, though for entirely different reasons. While Eleanor stood on society's margins through awkwardness and intellectual interests deemed inappropriate for her sex, the Duke occupied a position of fearsome isolation, his wealth and title granting him immunity from the rules that constrained others. No one would dare openly mock Sebastian Blackthorne, as Victoria had mocked her, yet his solitude seemed no less complete for being built on intimidation rather than dismissal. The realization that they were both, in their own ways, outsiders to the glittering world beyond the library doors created an unexpected current of understanding between them, tenuous but unmistakable in the quiet space they now shared. The secluded alcove tucked away in the farthest corner of the library offered a haven of privacy, two leather wingback chairs positioned on either side of a small mahogany table, as though specifically designed for intimate conversation rather than solitary reading. Eleanor had allowed the Duke to guide her to this sanctuary, curiosity temporarily overcoming her caution. As they settled into the chairs, the soft leather creaking gently beneath their weight, her eyes were drawn immediately to the slim volume resting on the table between them. She could not suppress a small gasp of recognition, her academic interest momentarily eclipsing her social discomfort. "Is that Heidegger's fundamental concepts of metaphysics, Your Grace?" she inquired, leaning forward slightly to better see the German text embossed on the leather binding. "Few people recognize Heidegger's value," the Duke commented, his tone reflecting genuine surprise as he regarded her with heightened interest. His large hand rested possessively on the book, long fingers splayed across its cover in a gesture that struck Eleanor as both protective and appreciative. "Fewer still understand him," she responded without thinking, then immediately wondered if she had overstepped by implying her comprehension of such complex philosophical work. Women were expected to discuss poetry, or perhaps the lighter classics, not German metaphysics. The Duke's eyebrows rose fractionally, and Eleanor watched as his assessment of her visibly shifted, his penetrating grey eyes studying her face with newfound attention. "You are familiar with his work, then?" he stated, rather than asked, turning slightly in his chair to face her more directly. "I have been searching for this particular translation for months," Eleanor admitted, intellectual excitement momentarily overcoming her usual reserve. "The London booksellers claim it won't be available in England for at least another year." The Duke nodded, a flicker of something like approval crossing his austere features. "I had it brought directly from Berlin," he explained, his deep voice softening slightly as they entered the shared territory of genuine intellectual interest. His concept of profound boredom as a fundamental mood revealing the emptiness behind social convention seems particularly relevant in certain company, he added, with what Eleanor suddenly realized was a subtle reference to the very ball they had both escaped. The observation startled a genuine laugh from her, quickly stifled behind her hand, but not before the Duke had registered it with evident satisfaction. Their conversation flowed with surprising ease after that initial connection, moving from Heidegger to broader German philosophy, then to differences between continental and British philosophical traditions. Eleanor found herself increasingly animated as the Duke challenged her interpretations with insights that revealed a truly formidable mind behind his intimidating exterior. More remarkable still was his willingness to consider her counterarguments, treating her intellectual positions with a seriousness she had rarely experienced outside correspondence with other female scholars. With each exchange, the space between them seemed to reconfigure itself, no longer defined by their respective social positions, but by the invisible architecture of ideas they were constructing together. Eleanor gradually became aware that the Duke was watching her with an intensity that went beyond academic interest, observing the flush of enthusiasm on her cheeks and the graceful movements of her hands as she emphasized particular points. For his part, Sebastian Blackthorne was discovering that the reserved spinster daughter of Viscount Blackwood possessed not merely a passing acquaintance with complex ideas, but a deeply original mind, capable of insights that challenged his own carefully constructed intellectual framework. The notorious Duke of Thornfield, feared in boardrooms and ballrooms alike, found himself experiencing something entirely unexpected in that quiet library alcove, a sensation he eventually recognized as respect, tinged with a curiosity that had nothing to do with books and everything to do with the remarkable woman discussing them so passionately before him. The Pembroke Ballroom had reached its zenith of activity when Eleanor finally emerged from her library sanctuary, the orchestra playing a spirited quadrille that filled the vast space with sound and movement, while couples whirled across the polished floor in perfect synchronicity. Though her eyes remained slightly reddened from her earlier emotional release, Eleanor carried herself with a composure that had been absent when she fled an hour before, something in her bearing subtly altered by the unexpected encounter in the library. Whispers still followed her progress across the room, Lady Victoria's barbed comments having circulated thoroughly during her absence, yet they seemed to touch her less deeply now, as though the conversation with the Duke had formed an invisible barrier between Eleanor and society's casual cruelties. She had barely reached her assigned seat when her aunt, Lady Millicent Blackwood, descended upon her with poorly concealed concern, etched across her features. "Where have you been hiding, dear?" she inquired, her eyes darting around the room as though assessing how many had noted Eleanor's prolonged disappearance. "Finding better company than deserved me here," Eleanor replied cryptically, accepting a glass of punch from a passing footman with a small nod of thanks. Her aunt studied her with narrowed eyes, clearly sensing something had transpired during her niece's absence, but unable to decipher the subtle transformation in Eleanor's demeanor. Before Lady Millicent could press further, a ripple of awareness passed through the nearby guests, conversations pausing momentarily as the Duke of Thornfield entered the ballroom through the same doors Eleanor had used minutes earlier. He moved through the crowd with characteristic authority, acknowledging greetings with minimal courtesy while maintaining the aloof expression that had become his hallmark in society. Several ambitious mothers with eligible daughters straightened immediately, their calculating gazes following his progress, while mentally reviewing strategies for engineering introductions. The Duke, however, seemed entirely indifferent to the stir his appearance created, his attention focused elsewhere with singular intensity. Across the crowded room, his eyes found Eleanor with unerring precision, holding her gaze for a brief moment before offering a nearly imperceptible nod, acknowledging their shared secret, before continuing on his way toward his host. The subtle exchange lasted mere seconds, unnoticed by most of the assembled guests, yet Eleanor felt the weight of it as tangibly as if he had crossed the room to speak with her directly. Lady Millicent, however, missed nothing, her years of navigating society having honed her observational skills to razor sharpness. "Eleanor, dear, did you perhaps encounter the Duke during your absence?" she inquired with careful nonchalance that failed to disguise her sudden intense interest. "He appeared to acknowledge you just now." "I believe the Duke was merely being polite, Aunt," Eleanor responded, struggling to keep her expression neutral despite the warmth creeping into her cheeks. Even as she deflected her aunt's curiosity, Eleanor sensed a fundamental shift in her relationship to the glittering, superficial world surrounding her. The ballroom remained as intimidating and exclusionary as before, its unwritten rules and subtle hierarchies designed to elevate some while diminishing others, yet her perspective had altered. For the first time, Eleanor had experienced the exhilaration of being truly seen by another, her mind engaged rather than dismissed, her thoughts valued rather than tolerated. That recognition, coming from the most unexpected source imaginable, had planted something resilient within her, a quiet certainty that would not easily be uprooted by society's casual cruelties or Lady Victoria's pointed barbs. Across the room, Sebastian Blackthorne endured the social niceties required of his station with mechanical precision, his thoughts repeatedly straying to the remarkable woman who had challenged his long-held assumptions about female intellect and the predetermined categories into which he had sorted humanity. The literary season in London offered a wealth of intellectual gatherings for those inclined toward more cerebral pursuits than the endless cycle of balls and dinners that occupied most of society. Eleanor had always found refuge in these events, moving between poetry readings at intimate salons, scholarly lectures on ancient civilizations held in musty university halls, and exclusive viewings of rare manuscripts organized for select bibliophiles. What changed, however, was the unexpected presence of the Duke of Thornfield at these previously overlooked occasions. The first encounter seemed merely coincidental, Sebastian Blackthorne appearing at the back of a crowded lecture on Etruscan burial practices, just as Eleanor settled into her usual seat near the front. Their eyes met briefly across the room, mutual recognition flickering between them before the Duke offered a slight bow of acknowledgement. By the third such meeting, at a private viewing of medieval illuminated texts at the British Museum, even Eleanor could no longer attribute his presence to chance. The Duke sought her out with increasing deliberation, no longer maintaining the pretense that their shared intellectual interests had simply placed them in the same location. Though he remained reserved by conventional standards, those who knew his reputation for aloofness would have been shocked by the attention he showed Lady Eleanor Blackwood, lingering near her at refreshment tables, offering observations that invited her response, eventually claiming seats beside her with an air of casual inevitability. Eleanor found herself experiencing an unfamiliar flutter of anticipation before each literary event, wondering if he would appear, secretly delighted when his tall figure materialized in doorways or across crowded rooms. These encounters existed in a realm apart from conventional social interactions, governed by the exchange of ideas rather than the currency of flattery and position that dominated ton gatherings. During a particularly spirited discussion following a controversial new translation of Homer, Eleanor had challenged the Duke's interpretation with a boldness that would have scandalized onlookers had they been in a ballroom rather than a book-lined study belonging to an eccentric professor. "Your insights challenge my thinking, Lady Eleanor," the Duke admitted afterward, falling into step beside her as they exited into the cool evening air, his tone reflecting genuine respect rather than mere courtesy. "I cannot recall the last time anyone has forced me to reconsider a position so thoroughly held." The admission, offered without reservation, marked a turning point in their evolving connection. Sebastian Blackthorne was a man unaccustomed to acknowledging intellectual equals in any sphere, yet he had publicly conceded to her superior argument without apparent concern for traditional gender hierarchies that would have demanded her deference to his opinion regardless of its merit. For her part, Eleanor discovered that the formidable Duke possessed not only a brilliant analytical mind, but unexpected flashes of dry humor that emerged more frequently as their acquaintance deepened. His observations on the pomposity of certain scholars, or the circular arguments presented in popular texts, would catch her off guard, coaxing surprised laughter from her that earned curious glances from others nearby. The scholarly community, absorbed in their specialized interests, paid little attention to the social significance of their interactions, creating an island of genuine connection amidst London's sea of superficial engagements. While other gentlemen and ladies exchanged practiced compliments and strategic flattery across ballrooms and dinner tables, Eleanor and Sebastian built something far more substantial through vigorous debate, shared discoveries, and the mutual recognition of finding someone whose mind operated on the same plane as one's own, a rarity that neither had experienced before. Eleanor gradually realized that the Duke's fearsome reputation in society stemmed partly from this very quality, his refusal to engage in meaningless social rituals or pretend interest in trivial concerns, marking him as dangerous to a world built on precisely such pretenses. The subtle undercurrents of London society had an uncanny ability to detect even the most carefully concealed connections, particularly those involving its most eligible and formidable bachelor. What began as isolated observations of the Duke of Thornfield appearing at literary gatherings, traditionally beneath his notice, soon coalesced into full-fledged speculation that spread through drawing rooms and across tea tables with remarkable speed. Eleanor, who had spent years being politely overlooked at social gatherings, suddenly found herself the subject of intense scrutiny, her every movement and expression analyzed for evidence of her mysterious appeal to the kingdom's most feared nobleman. The attention manifested in multiple forms, from the increased invitations to events where the Duke might be present to the calculating reassessments from matrons who had previously dismissed her as a confirmed spinster of no particular consequence. Most unsettling were the barely concealed whispers that reached her ears as she moved through society, fragments of gossip that revealed the true nature of ton speculation. "The Duke of Thornfield asking about your reading preferences," Lady Hartwell exclaimed during one particularly uncomfortable afternoon tea, her voice pitched with theatrical amazement. "My dear, he barely acknowledges royalty when they address him directly." What could you possibly have said to capture such interest? Eleanor felt her cheeks warm under the older woman's penetrating stare, conscious of the 6 other ladies who had abandoned their own conversations to await her response. "We merely discovered a shared appreciation for classical philosophy," she replied with careful neutrality, though she could not entirely suppress the flicker of pleasure that accompanied the memory of their most recent debate over Aristotelian ethics. The explanation was met with polite disbelief, several ladies exchanging knowing glances that suggested they presumed a far more conventional attraction at work. More concerning were the whispers Eleanor accidentally overheard while browsing in a bookshop near Berkeley Square, 2 gentlemen discussing the Duke's sudden interest in the Blackwood family with undisguised cynicism. "Must be the shipping connections," the older man had stated with absolute conviction. "Blackwood vessels have access to ports in India that Thornfield has been trying to enter for years. Always a strategic reason behind his attentions, mark my words." Eleanor had frozen behind a tall shelf, the book in her hands momentarily forgotten as doubt crept through her mind like an insidious fog. Her father's shipping interests, while not extensive, did indeed include valuable Indian trading routes that many English merchants coveted. The suggestion that her intellectual connection with Sebastian might be merely a calculated business maneuver felt like a physical blow, undermining the fragile foundation of mutual respect she had believed they were building. Yet even as these external voices attempted to reframe their relationship according to conventional social equations, Eleanor could not reconcile such calculating motives with the genuine engagement she had witnessed in the Duke's expressions during their most heated debates, or the rare moments when his guard lowered enough to reveal flashes of vulnerability beneath his formidable exterior. The growing external attention created a complicated emotional landscape for Eleanor, discomfort at being thrust into a spotlight she had never sought, mingling with quiet pleasure at the connection that had prompted such interest. As speculation intensified with each public sighting of them together, Eleanor found herself in the unfamiliar position of having to defend her own perceptions against society's determined reinterpretation of her experience, introducing the first seeds of doubt into what had been, until then, a refreshingly uncomplicated meeting of compatible minds. Thornfield House stood imposing against the green backdrop of the Surrey countryside, its ancient grey stone walls rising majestically from meticulously maintained grounds, the ancestral seat of the Blackthorns for over 4 centuries. Though Eleanor had visited many great houses during her years in society, she found herself uncharacteristically nervous as their carriage approached the sweeping drive, her aunt Lady Millicent fussing beside her with undisguised excitement at receiving such a coveted invitation. The Duke greeted them personally at the entrance, a breach of protocol that raised Lady Millicent's eyebrows, but pleased Eleanor immensely, suggesting an eagerness that matched her own carefully concealed anticipation. While the obligatory tour of public rooms proceeded with formal courtesy, Eleanor sensed Sebastian's growing impatience, a subtle tension in his bearing that only relaxed when he finally announced his intention to show Lady Eleanor his private library, offering Lady Millicent the companionship of his sister for refreshments in the drawing-room. The moment the library doors closed behind them, Eleanor gasped audibly, overwhelmed by the sheer magnificence of the space before her. Unlike the formal, aesthetically designed libraries of most noble homes, often arranged more for appearance than use, the Thornfield Library was clearly a living, breathing sanctuary of knowledge. 3 stories of books stretched toward a painted ceiling, connected by wrought iron spiral staircases and sliding ladders, while comfortable reading nooks were nestled between mahogany cases. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating private alcoves filled with maps and manuscripts spread across reading tables, as though the owner had simply stepped away momentarily. "My father built this collection, but few have ever appreciated it as you do," the Duke confessed, his deep voice unusually soft as he watched Eleanor move reverently among the shelves, her fingers hovering just above leather spines without touching, a gesture of respect he immediately recognized and approved. "This is where I spend most of my time when at Thornfield, away from the demands of business and society." Eleanor nodded in perfect understanding, momentarily beyond words, as she absorbed the extraordinary privilege of being admitted to this inner sanctum. As Sebastian guided her deeper into the collection, showing her increasingly rare volumes, Eleanor noticed something that stopped her mid-step, causing her breath to catch. "The classification system," she murmured, moving closer to examine the small labels affixed to each shelf. "This is not the standard Dewey arrangement. It's an adaptation of a system I developed myself," the Duke explained, watching her closely. "I found traditional methods inadequate for interdisciplinary works." Eleanor turned to face him, her expression a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. But this specific arrangement, connecting philosophical schools with their historical contexts rather than separating disciplines, she began hesitantly. "I proposed it in a paper published in the Journal of Library Science last year under the pseudonym E.B. Harwick." The Duke met her gaze directly, neither confirming nor denying. Instead, he led her to a small desk tucked into a window alcove, where she discovered copies of all her published works, including those written under various pseudonyms, carefully annotated in a precise masculine hand. The revelation left Eleanor momentarily speechless, the implications washing over her in waves of understanding. Sebastian Blackthorne, the notorious Duke feared across business and society, had not only read but studied her scholarly contributions, valued them enough to implement her ideas, and recognized her intellect long before their first meeting. The depth of this connection, built on genuine intellectual respect rather than mere social or romantic interest, created between them a bond so profound that Eleanor felt momentarily dizzy with its significance. In this private sanctuary, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge that had shaped them both, Eleanor glimpsed for the first time the true man beneath the fearsome exterior, a solitary scholar who had recognized in her a kindred spirit worthy of his trust and vulnerability. The prestigious Midsummer Literary Society gathering represented the pinnacle of intellectual social events in London, its hallowed traditions and exclusive membership comprising scholars, authors, and aristocrats with genuine academic credentials rather than merely fashionable pretensions. Eleanor had attended these quarterly meetings for years, finding rare acceptance among this community where ideas held greater currency than titles or beauty. This particular evening had begun pleasantly enough, the grand salon of Lord Pembourne's townhouse filled with animated discussions of recent publications and scholarly debates, lending the atmosphere of vibrant energy, entirely absent from conventional social gatherings. Eleanor moved through the crowd with unusual ease, her recent appearances in the company of the Duke of Thornfield having elevated her standing even within this meritocratic circle. She failed to notice Lady Victoria Winfield observing her from across the room, the beautiful young woman's presence at such an event being itself unusual enough to have warranted comment among regular attendees. What Eleanor could not know was that Victoria had orchestrated her invitation through careful manipulation of her uncle's position on the membership committee, her purpose not intellectual enrichment but carefully calculated revenge. The opportunity arose during the evening's formal discussion, a tradition wherein members presented noteworthy texts for group analysis. Lord Pembourne had just completed reading a passage from an obscure Persian philosophical work recently translated into English when Victoria raised her gloved hand with practiced delicacy. "I wonder," she began, her melodious voice carrying across the now quiet room, "if we might benefit from Lady Eleanor Blackwood's interpretation of this particularly challenging passage. She is, after all, known for her expansive knowledge of Eastern philosophical traditions. Perhaps Lady Eleanor might enlighten us on this passage's meaning," Victoria suggested with false sweetness, her eyes glittering with malicious anticipation. The room turned expectantly toward Eleanor, who felt a momentary surge of panic rising in her chest. The Persian text was deliberately obscure, its translation controversial, and Victoria had clearly expected her ignorance to be publicly exposed, completing the humiliation begun at the Pembroke ball. Eleanor glanced instinctively toward Sebastian, standing near a window across the room, his tall figure instantly recognizable. His expression had darkened dangerously as he recognized the trap, his body tensing as though preparing to intervene. But as their eyes met briefly across the crowded salon, Eleanor felt an unexpected calm replace her initial fear. The Duke had shown her this very translation in his library just days before. their discussion of its controversial passages having occupied an entire afternoon. Drawing a deep breath, Eleanor rose gracefully to her feet and began to speak, her voice growing steadily stronger as she addressed the complexities of the text, comparing the new translation with earlier interpretations and connecting its central arguments to both Western and Eastern philosophical traditions. Her comprehensive analysis left the room in impressed silence, several senior scholars nodding appreciatively at insights they themselves had not considered. When she finished, applause broke out spontaneously, while Lady Victoria sat rigid with fury, her scheme having backfired spectacularly. From his position across the room, Sebastian watched with undisguised admiration, something fierce and protective in his gaze that transcended mere intellectual approval. As the formal discussion concluded and members broke into smaller conversational groups, Eleanor found herself surrounded by genuine appreciation, scholars seeking her opinions on related texts. The satisfaction of this triumph was made complete when she glimpsed Victoria slipping away early, her carefully constructed humiliation having transformed instead into a moment of scholarly triumph that would cement Eleanor's reputation in intellectual circles permanently. The stunned silence that followed Eleanor's comprehensive analysis of the Persian text had barely settled when the Duke of Thornfield stepped forward from his position near the window, his commanding presence instantly drawing every eye in the room. Before Lady Victoria could recover enough to attempt further mischief, Sebastian spoke in a voice that carried effortlessly through the salon, its measured tone belying the cold fury evident in his expression. "Lady Victoria," he began, addressing her directly rather than the assembly at large, a breach of protocol that emphasized the personal nature of his intervention. "Since you have such interest in Eastern philosophical traditions, perhaps you might share with us your interpretation of the comparative themes in Confucian and Taoist approaches to governance." The challenge, delivered with deadly precision, exposed the trap Victoria had attempted to set. Her momentary expression of panic confirmed what everyone now understood, that she had no genuine knowledge of the subject she had so confidently introduced. "I have found Lady Eleanor's understanding of literature unmatched in London society, including by those who use knowledge merely as a weapon," the Duke stated coldly when Victoria failed to respond, his gaze sweeping the assembled scholars and aristocrats with such intensity that several flinched visibly. Her contributions to academic discourse, both acknowledged and anonymous, represent the true spirit of intellectual inquiry that this society was founded to foster. The unprecedented public declaration from a man known for his reticence created a ripple of shocked whispers throughout the room. Never in the memory of even the oldest members had the Duke of Thornfield expressed such open admiration for anyone, let alone defended someone against social attack. As he moved to stand beside Eleanor, Sebastian briefly allowed his hand to touch hers, a gesture of support and solidarity that, though momentary, was observed by everyone present. The significance of that simple touch, conveying intimacy and connection that transcended mere intellectual respect, would be dissected in drawing rooms across London by morning. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush with a combination of surprise at his intervention and the profound emotion his words had stirred within her. She had grown accustomed to his respect in their private interactions, but this public acknowledgement of her worth represented something far more significant, a declaration that could not be misinterpreted or dismissed as mere courtesy. For the Duke of Thornfield to place his formidable reputation and influence behind her so unequivocally altered the social equation permanently. Lady Victoria, now recognizing the catastrophic miscalculation of her attack, attempted to salvage her dignity with a brittle smile. "I merely sought to highlight Lady Eleanor's expertise." "Your Grace," she demurred, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her awareness of having made a powerful enemy. "I had no idea you took such personal interest in academic discussions." The implication behind her words hung in the air, transforming what had begun as an intellectual gathering into something far more consequential. The public acknowledgement of a connection between the kingdom's most feared duke and the woman's society had long dismissed. As conversation gradually resumed around them, Eleanor became acutely conscious of the weight of Sebastian's hand, now resting properly at the small of her back, a position that, while entirely appropriate for offering support to a lady who had been distressed, carried implications of possession and protection that no one present could possibly miss. The Duke of Thornfield had made his preference known, and in doing so had irrevocably altered both their positions in society. The moonlit garden behind the society building offered blessed respite from the charged atmosphere inside, its secluded pathways winding between carefully tended roses and night-blooming flowers that released their heady fragrance into the evening air. Eleanor had slipped away as conversations resumed following the confrontation, seeking a moment to compose herself after the tumultuous emotions of the evening. She had barely reached a small stone bench partially hidden by a flowering jasmine when she sensed rather than heard someone following her into the garden. Even before turning, she knew it was Sebastian, his presence having become instantly recognizable to her over the past weeks. He stood several paces away, tall and imposing in the silver moonlight that transformed his austere features into something almost otherworldly. The public declaration he had made inside the society rooms hung between them, its implications too significant to ignore, yet too overwhelming to address directly. "Eleanor," he said simply, her given name on his lips in this private setting carrying an intimacy that made her heart quicken. "I must speak with you." The customary command in his tone had softened to something closer to a request, revealing vulnerability rarely glimpsed beneath his formidable exterior. Eleanor remained seated on the bench, suddenly understanding that her stillness offered him the space to approach on his own terms. He moved closer with uncharacteristic hesitation, finally settling beside her with a careful distance maintained between them. For several moments they sat in silence, the distant sounds of the gathering inside barely penetrating their secluded sanctuary. "I was 7 when my parents died," he began abruptly, his gaze fixed on the moonlit rose garden rather than her face. Fever took them both within days of each other. "My grandfather was Duke then, a cold man who viewed children as nuisances to be shaped rather than nurtured." Eleanor listened without interruption, understanding instinctively that this unprecedented sharing of personal history represented a trust more profound than any declaration made in public could convey. "Books became my refuge," Sebastian continued, his voice taking on a quality she had never heard before, stripped of its usual authoritative resonance. "The library at Thornfield was the one place my grandfather rarely entered. I could disappear for hours among those shelves, finding companions in characters and comfort in the ordered world of knowledge when everything else felt chaotic and lonely." The confession of childhood vulnerability from a man's society viewed as invulnerable touched Eleanor deeply, creating connections between his fearsome adult persona and the isolated child who had preceded it. "I have feared, and been feared all my life, Eleanor," Sebastian said finally, turning to face her directly, his grey eyes reflecting the moonlight with unexpected brightness. "Until you saw beyond that, to the man behind the title." The raw emotion in his voice stripped away the last barriers between them, revealing that beneath the notorious Duke of Thornfield existed simply Sebastian, a man whose isolation mirrored her own in many ways, though born of different circumstances. Where Eleanor had been dismissed and overlooked, Sebastian had been feared and misunderstood, both experiences creating souls that had learned to seek connection through ideas rather than conventional social bonds. Eleanor found herself reaching for his hand before she could consider the propriety of such a gesture, her fingers entwining with his in wordless understanding of shared experience. "My parents never understood my preference for books over balls," she offered in return, her own confession creating balance between them. "My sisters were all beauty and charm while I was all questions and arguments. After a while, it seemed easier to retreat into scholarship than repeatedly disappoint expectations I could never fulfill." The vulnerability they exchanged in that moonlit garden transcended mere romantic attraction, creating between them a recognition of kindred spirits who had found in each other the acceptance they had sought all their lives. He through intimidation, and she through intellectual retreat. The garden path brought them to a literal crossroads where several walkways converged around a small fountain, its gentle splashing creating a soothing melody in the night air. Sebastian rose from the bench, drawing Eleanor to her feet beside him, still maintaining his gentle hold on her hand. The moonlight illuminated his aristocratic features with unusual softness, revealing nuances of expression typically concealed by his carefully maintained reserve. "Eleanor," he began, his voice deep and resonant in the quiet garden, "I have existed rather than lived for most of my adult life, moving through the world as the Duke of Thornfield, a title rather than a man. When I met you in that library, something awakened in me that I had forgotten existed, the possibility of genuine connection with another human being." His directness was characteristic of his approach to all matters, yet Eleanor detected an underlying vulnerability that made this moment entirely different from his confident business negotiations or authoritative social pronouncements. "I am not a man given to romantic declarations or flowery sentiments," he continued, "but I find I cannot imagine returning to my solitary existence now that I have discovered what it means to be truly understood. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, Eleanor, not for my title or fortune, but for the possibility of building a life together founded on mutual respect and understanding?" The proposal, delivered with Sebastian Blackthorne's typical straightforwardness, nevertheless contained emotional depths that belied his reputation for coldness. Eleanor felt momentarily overwhelmed, her heart recognizing the rightness of their connection, even as her mind raised practical objections born of years of social conditioning. "You could have any woman in England, Sebastian," she said softly, giving voice to the doubt that had lingered since society first noticed their association. Why choose one who was banished from ballrooms, someone deemed too plain, too intellectual, too unconventional to be truly desirable? The question was not coyness or false modesty, but a genuine fear that he might eventually regret choosing someone society considered so thoroughly unexceptional. Sebastian stepped closer, his free hand rising to gently touch her cheek in a gesture so tender it nearly undid her composure. "I have observed the women society deems desirable all my life, Eleanor," he responded, his voice rough with emotion. "Beautiful, accomplished creatures trained since birth to reflect a man's status rather than challenge his mind or touch his soul. When I am with you, I am neither feared nor flattered, but simply understood. You see me, not the Duke, not the fortune, not the power, but the man beneath all those trappings, the lonely boy who found solace in books, the adult who built walls to protect what remained of his heart." Eleanor noticed with surprise that his hand trembled slightly against her cheek, this small betrayal of nervousness from a man renowned for his unshakable composure, affecting her more deeply than any grand romantic gesture could have done. The Duke of Thornfield, feared in business negotiations across continents, was vulnerable before her, awaiting her answer with an uncertainty that revealed just how much her response meant to him. The realization that this formidable man had placed his carefully guarded heart in her hands created a surge of protective tenderness within Eleanor, even as doubt continued to whisper that she might not be enough to satisfy him in the years to come, that her scholarly interests and unfashionable appearance might eventually disappoint a man accustomed to commanding the finest of everything. The Pembroke Library had been transformed beyond recognition by the time Eleanor arrived in response to the Duke's mysterious invitation. What had once been a sanctuary of hushed solitude now glowed with the light of 100 candles placed strategically throughout the vast space, their golden illumination casting the room in a warm, intimate ambience entirely different from the dim refuge she had sought weeks earlier. Eleanor stood transfixed in the doorway, momentarily unable to comprehend the scene before her. A small dining table had been arranged near the large fireplace, where a cheerful blaze dispelled the evening chill, crystal and silver gleaming in the candlelight, but it was not this elegant setting that captured her attention most forcefully. Around the room, displayed on specially constructed stands, were dozens of first editions of works she had mentioned admiring during their conversations, volumes so rare she had only read about many of them in scholarly journals, Shakespeare folios, illuminated medieval texts, early printings of Greek philosophical treatises, each positioned to be admired, each representing a piece of her intellectual journey that Sebastian had noted and remembered. She moved forward in a daze, fingers hovering reverently above leather bindings and gilt tooling, tears threatening as she recognized the profound understanding this display represented. Sebastian stepped from behind a tall bookshelf, watching her reaction with uncharacteristic uncertainty evident in his usually confident bearing. He had abandoned his formal evening attire for a simpler dark coat that somehow made him appear more approachable, more the scholar than the intimidating duke. "When you did not immediately answer my proposal in the garden," he began, his deep voice unusually gentle, "I realized I had failed to demonstrate adequately what you mean to me, what we might build together." Before Eleanor could respond, he guided her to a reading stand positioned prominently near the table, where an ancient manuscript lay open, its vellum pages illuminated with gold leaf and intricate illustrations. She recognized it instantly, a 12th century philosophical text discussing the nature of true partnership, finding one's equal in mind and spirit. The specific passage displayed had been carefully chosen, speaking of connections that transcended worldly considerations to forge bonds between kindred souls. "You once hid here in shame, Eleanor," Sebastian said, his hand finding hers as they stood before the manuscript. "I want this to be where you choose to build a future instead, where the memory of humiliation is replaced by the foundation of something far more significant." The deliberate transformation of the space where she had retreated in distress into a celebration of her intellectual passions struck Eleanor with overwhelming force. Every volume, every carefully arranged detail reflected not merely Sebastian's wealth or influence, but his profound understanding of what truly mattered to her, what brought her joy and meaning. This was not the gesture of a man who saw her as a temporary fascination or convenient intellectual companion, but one who had observed her essence with rare perception and valued what he discovered there. The doubts that had plagued her since his proposal began to dissolve in the face of such tangible evidence of his regard. Eleanor turned to face him fully, suddenly recognizing that the fearsome Duke of Thornfield, the man whose mere presence caused hardened businessmen to tremble, stood before her with vulnerability, evident in every line of his posture, awaiting her response with barely concealed apprehension. The realization that this powerful man had laid his carefully guarded heart at her feet not once but twice, returning to offer it again despite her hesitation, created a surge of certainty within her that swept away remaining reservations. "Sebastian," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her, "you have shown me not merely that you understand my mind, but that you value it above all the conventional attractions society prizes. I would be honored to build a future with you, not as the Duchess of Thornfield, but as your partner in mind and spirit." The news of Lady Eleanor Blackwood's engagement to the Duke of Thornfield spread through London society with unprecedented speed, creating ripples of shock and disbelief that manifested in countless drawing rooms, dinner parties, and morning calls across the fashionable districts. What had begun as curious speculation about an unlikely intellectual connection transformed overnight into the scandal of the season. A confirmed betrothal between the kingdom's most eligible bachelor and a woman's society had long since relegated to the margins of relevance. The initial reactions ranged from open disbelief to thinly veiled derision, with several notable hostesses going so far as to suggest that the Duke must have suffered some manner of temporary madness or fallen victim to an inexplicable obsession that would surely pass before wedding arrangements could be completed. Yet these predictions were soundly disproven by the couple's first public appearance following the announcement at the Countess of Weston's musical evening, where Sebastian and Eleanor arrived together with neither fanfare nor apology, their quiet dignity in the face of barely disguised curiosity, establishing the tone that would characterize their approach to society's judgment. Eleanor, who had spent years attempting to avoid attention at such gatherings, found herself the center of intense scrutiny, yet the nervous discomfort that would once have overwhelmed her was noticeably absent. In its place resided a newfound confidence, born not of arrogance, but of the profound certainty that she was genuinely valued for precisely those qualities society had previously dismissed. Sebastian, for his part, maintained his characteristic reserve, yet close observers noted subtle but significant changes in his demeanor, a protective attentiveness toward Eleanor, and occasional moments when his expression softened as he watched her engage with others. betraying an emotional connection entirely at odds with his fearsome reputation. The turning point in society's perception came during Lady Hartwell's annual garden party, when Lady Victoria, still smarting from her public humiliation at the literary society gathering, approached the couple with a smile that failed to reach her cold eyes. "What an unexpected match, Your Grace," she remarked with poisonous sweetness, addressing Sebastian while pointedly ignoring Eleanor. "Society remains positively baffled by your choice." It was Eleanor who responded, her voice calm and assured in a way that surprised even those who had known her for years. "The truly valuable things in life are often overlooked by those searching only for shine, Lady Victoria," she observed with perfect composure. "How fortunate that His Grace possesses more discerning vision than most." The quiet dignity of her response, neither apologetic nor confrontational, silenced Victoria more effectively than any angry retort could have done. More significantly, it established Eleanor as someone who would neither flaunt her elevated position nor apologize for occupying it, a stance that gradually earned the reluctant respect of even the most skeptical observers. As weeks passed and the couple continued to appear together at carefully selected events, society began the inevitable process of adjustment, their initial shock giving way to acceptance, and eventually to a new narrative that recast their connection as a romantic triumph of substance over superficiality. The Duke of Thornfield, whose cold demeanor had once caused matrons to shield their daughters from his critical gaze, found his reputation softened by his evident devotion to Eleanor. The transformation from fearsome bachelor to attentive fiancé, providing fresh material for drawing-room conversations across London. For Eleanor and Sebastian, these external adjustments mattered far less than the private certainty they shared, the knowledge that in finding each other they had discovered something far more valuable than social approval, a connection founded on genuine understanding rather than the transient currency of beauty, youth, or fashionable charm. The grand library of Thornfield House shone with morning light streaming through tall windows, dust motes dancing in golden beams that illuminated the 3 stories of meticulously arranged volumes stretching from floor to ceiling. The space had evolved over the past year under Eleanor's direction, maintaining its scholarly grandeur while becoming more accessible, more vibrant with intellectual life than ever before. Sebastian and Eleanor worked companionably at a massive oak table positioned near the eastern windows, their heads bent together over a collection of rare astronomical manuscripts recently acquired from an aging Italian scholar. The Duchess of Thornfield, as society now acknowledged her, had settled into her role with a natural dignity that transformed both the position and perceptions of the woman who held it, her scholarly reputation now extending far beyond the limited circles that had previously recognized her contributions. She had maintained her intellectual pursuits with her husband's full support, her most recent work on comparative religious philosophies prominently displayed near the entrance of the library, published under her own name rather than the pseudonyms necessity had once demanded. Sebastian passed her another volume, their fingers touching briefly in a casual intimacy that still sent pleasant warmth through Eleanor even after months of marriage. They worked in the comfortable silence of 2 people, whose connection required no constant verbal affirmation, each anticipating the other's needs or thoughts with remarkable synchronicity, born of shared passion and genuine understanding. The contentment that radiated between them had gradually softened the Duke's fearsome reputation in wider society, though he maintained his formidable demeanor in business dealings, that transformation reserved primarily for the private world he and Eleanor had constructed together. "Who would have thought being banished from a ballroom would lead to finding my true home?" Eleanor mused aloud, pausing to look around at the magnificent space that had become the heart of their shared life, not merely a physical location, but the embodiment of their intellectual partnership. Sebastian glanced up from the manuscript before him, his grey eyes warming as they met hers, his austere features relaxing into the smile he reserved exclusively for her. "I should perhaps send Lady Victoria a note of gratitude," he suggested dryly, though his expression sobered as he reached for Eleanor's hand. "We both spent too many years in isolation, believing ourselves understood only by the silent companions on these shelves." The truth of this observation touched Eleanor deeply, reminding her of their parallel journeys from solitude to connection. What had begun as an unexpected encounter between two outsiders, one dismissed and one feared by a society that valued neither genuine intellect nor authentic character, had blossomed into something neither had believed possible, a partnership founded on mutual respect that had deepened into profound love. They had created together a world where both were valued precisely for their true selves. Their shared passion for knowledge, expanding into broader horizons as they established scholarships for promising students, regardless of background, and hosted intellectual gatherings that had become the most coveted invitations in London. As they returned to their work, categorizing and discussing the astronomical texts that would soon join the growing Thornfield collection, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from the margins of society to this place of belonging. The path had begun with humiliation, with being banished from a ballroom where she had never truly fit, only to lead her to a library where she had found not merely refuge but recognition, not only intellectual stimulation but the rarest of treasures, a heart that matched her own in both mind and spirit.